Hey everybody, it's Lance from Permanent Records. On this channel, I share with you my thoughts about vinyl records, the industry, and the records themselves. And here today, I am going to share with you some of my favorite picks out of our top shelf recent arrivals. So, as you can see, we have rare records all over the walls here at Permanent Records. And not only do we have these records behind me, we have a whole bin full of records that are priced at $60 and up. Some into the multi-hundreds, and some of the things on the wall are four-figure records. Some real, true rarities and grails up on the walls that some of which may be behind me, but mostly are featured over here behind the counter for safekeeping. Well, today I'm going to do a short video. I'm going to try to keep this as short and sweet as possible because I know you don't want me to ramble on and on and on about these things, but I am going to share with you some of my favorites out of the current batch of wall records, or top shelf as we call them here at Permanent Records Roadhouse. But before we get into that, please be sure to subscribe to this channel if you don't already. Like this video, ring the bell, and shoot me a comment below so that I can hear your thoughts on my thoughts and share my thoughts with you. Thank you very much for that. Now, on to the goods. Okay, right here in front of me, first and foremost, we have a very cool Vertigo title, Remasis Space Hymns. This record lies somewhere between the prog, psych, and space rock realms. This is a really, really groovy album. I highly recommend it if you're a fan of Hawkwind or early UFO. It's also got some elements of prog, as I mentioned, and it kind of has some pretty mellow moments as well, surprisingly, considering that really ominous artwork. Anyway, this is a really great Vertigo that doesn't get talked about a whole lot. It's not one of the most expensive records on the label, but it definitely, the OG UK, has some significant value. Here's the one I'm showing up in the thumbnail. This is an absolutely stunning copy of the classic A Love Supreme by John Coltrane. Nothing more needs to be said about this album. If you're a rock person, or I guess I should say, if you don't think you like jazz and you have even a slight interest in getting into jazz records, might I recommend you start with this one. A Love Supreme has all the elements that everybody loves about spiritual jazz. There's some elements of free jazz here, a little bit of post-bop, and this is the John Coltrane record to listen to first if you are uninitiated. He's the GOAT, and this is one of the greatest albums of all time, in my opinion, regardless of genre. Another one of the greatest albums of all time is this Big Star record. Big Star, everybody should at this point be familiar. Even though they were unsung in their day, they have had a cult following for a very long time, and many people, many more people now, luckily, are familiar with Big Star than they were when these records came out. They did not sell well back in the day. They were a commercial failure, unfortunately. But Big Star is timeless. These records have aged very, very well. And now the original pressings on Ardent are quite expensive. This is #1 record, an original pressing, like I said, in beautiful shape, and it fetches a premium at this point. Chris Bell, Alex Chilton, oh my gosh, those songwriters are just absolutely amazing. And if you like power pop or good songwriting or rock and roll in general and you don't know this record, stop watching this video immediately and go listen to all of the Big Star records, but maybe start with this one. All right, My Bloody Valentine. Not for everyone. My Bloody Valentine is one of the quintessential shoegaze bands. Shoegaze is a genre that relies very heavily on feedback as a part of the sound, and My Bloody Valentine and Kevin Shields are masters of controlling feedback and writing great pop songs that are basically structured around a lot of noise, or at least incorporate a lot of noise. Again, this is their album, Isn't Anything. If you haven't heard them at all, this is not a bad place to start, but I would definitely suggest trying Loveless first. That's my favorite and most people's favorite album by My Bloody Valentine. It's the classic shoegaze album of all the shoegaze albums. This is an original pressing on Creation. I'm sorry, this is on Relativity. We had an original pressing. Maybe this was never on Creation. Just forget I said that. This is an original pressing of that album, UK pressing, I believe. Lapsed by Bardo Pond. If you're not familiar with Bardo Pond already, that's okay. They're not a household name, but they are an absolutely incredible band. They're from Philadelphia, I believe, Pennsylvania. And these guys and gal, I think it's two brothers, another person and a female, I shouldn't be rattling off these details off the top of my head, are one of the greatest bands of the 90s. I think they operated maybe a little bit into the 2000s as well. Definitely not as prolific as they were in earlier eras, but yeah, this is really, really great, like just stoned to the bone indie rock stuff. Very experimental, but really, really nice and soothing most of the time. These guys get real far out, but they also stay grounded and stay fairly accessible. I'm trying to think of who I would compare Bardo Pond to. They're kind of in a league of their own in a lot of ways. Not as weird as Sun City Girls, but if you like Torch of the Mystics by Sun City Girls, you might enjoy Bardo Pond. Real droney, layered, psychedelic stuff, and mostly not terribly intense. Anyway, Lapsed is fantastic. This is a really interesting record. I showed this in one of my previous videos, but I didn't say much of anything about it. This, believe it or not, is Richard Horowitz. His name is spelled backwards on the front of the cover there, and the album is called Eros in Arabia. This is Richard Horowitz doing like a very kind of meditative, droney, Middle Eastern experimental record under a pseudonym that makes it sound like it's more foreign than it actually is. It's really fun to listen to, really repetitive, really hypnotic stuff, and just super interesting. I love this album art. If you show me an album that looks like this, I am gonna wanna hear it immediately. That really draws my attention, and I'm sure it does most of you as well. Back into more of a rock territory. This is Crossroad. This is one of the best private press Southern rock albums that exists. I highly recommend this. Riding Easy and I are going to be reissuing this album pretty soon, probably in early 2025. And if you like the hard and heavy, Skynyrd influenced Southern rock stuff, this record is for you. And this particular album is extremely rare and quite good. It's tough as nails and very hard to come by. Oh man, fans of the aforementioned Bardo Pond, and what else did we talk about? My Bloody Valentine. Here's another similar recommendation. Spaceman III's Playing with Fire. Spaceman III are one of my favorite bands of the 80s and into the 90s. These guys were, again, just amazing, hypnotic experimentalists. They really played with distortion and fuzz and feedback in a way that was really, really interesting, but they knew how to write a hook as well. Those of you who are familiar with Spiritualized will, or should, hopefully recognize this gentleman right here. That's Jay Spaceman from Spiritualized on the back there. Also, you got Pete Baseman and Sonic Boom, or Spectrum, but any of you familiar with those names probably already know about Spaceman III. One of my favorite bands of all time. Always was, will, and shall be near the top of the list. Getting back to another different kind of wall of sound, we got A Christmas Gift for You from Phil's Records. This is Phil Spector production and one of the greatest Christmas albums of all time. It includes Darlene Love, the Ronettes, Bobby Sox, the Crystals, etc. It's I think the most listenable Christmas album. I never get tired of listening to this. I can listen to this any time of the year, but it really, really strikes home when you listen to it around the holidays. Phil Spector, regardless of his personality, and I do highly recommend watching the docu-series. I think it's just called Spectre. I think it was streaming on Max. he's a despicable human being that did a lot of terrible things, and was totally unhinged and out of his mind most of the time. But he knew how to make a damn good record and get some incredible performances out of these musicians. And this album is proof positive that he was not a joker. I don't have a whole lot to say about this, but a lot of people are familiar with Los Lobos. Maybe not many of you as familiar with their first album, Los Lobos del Este de Los Angeles. Yeah, this is a Latin rock record, definitely more kind of in the, what would I say, ranchera vibe than it is in the rock vibe. But it's cool. It's cool to see the beginnings of a band that went on to great things and signed to a major label and sold a lot of records. I love hearing the first recordings by bands that went on to huge success, and this is a really interesting document. I believe this is a reissue based on the price. The original is quite expensive and very rare, and I don't know if it's ever been legitimately reissued or not. All right, we'll skip over a few things, but I have to show Albert King's Born Under a Bad Sign. This is one of the greatest electric blues records that exists. It's got one of the most iconic and appealing album covers of any of the electric blues albums, although it is in good company with Electric Mud and John Lee Hooker's Electric album that he didn't like, etc. Just, yeah, absolutely stunning stuff. I love the blues, but I think I like it even better when some of the blues masters pick up electric guitars and get a full band behind them and just rock out like this one does. Absolutely amazing stuff. Here's an oddball one. Over on the wall to my right, I don't think you can see it there because I'm pointing at a perpendicular wall, is an original pressing of the live album by Built to Spill. You know, I'd like to show records that many people that know my taste may not think that I would actually be a fan of. I think Built to Spill is one of the greatest bands of their era, one of the best indie rock bands of the 2000s, late 90s and 2000s. And this live album is what actually kind of put me into the Built to Spill fan camp. I was not particularly interested when I first heard these records. I was listening to very different stuff. I was very deep into the Discord catalog and listening to a lot more aggressive music and more intense things than Built to Spill. But a friend of mine encouraged me to come see Built to Spill with him in St. Louis when I lived in Columbia, Missouri, and they blew me away. The cover of Cortez the Killer by Neil Young on this album is absolutely stunning, and their live show was absolutely mind-blowing, and I highly recommend checking out this album if you're looking for a way to get into Built to Spill, but Perfect From Now On and the rest of their studio albums are all quite good. Doug, I can't think of his name right now, the main cat behind this band. Why am I trying to do this? Why do I do this to myself? I start saying words that I don't know off the top of my head, and I used to know this information, and I just can't think of his name right now. It doesn't matter, because who knows how time for that. Go check out Built to Spill live. Even the Record Store Day reissue, that's still sealed, is collectible of that album. All right, one of the greatest funk records of all time, Nasty Gal by Betty Davis. Most of you watching this are already familiar with the Betty Davis story. She was an amazing musician from Pittsburgh. She married Miles Davis, was married to Miles Davis for a significant period of time during his electric era. She has been cited as a big influence on his sound and style during that particular period, and she is a total badass. Betty Davis. This album, maybe not my favorite of hers, but it is nasty, as you might have imagined. Funk. A little more disco, a little more palatable than her earlier albums, but this one is fantastic as well. And do not sleep on anything that's got Betty Davis's name on it. She is amazing. Ton Steiner Scherben. I'm not going to pronounce the title of this album that's in German. were a German band from the krautrock era, the original krautrock era. But these guys were full on anarchists. This is like really, really gnarly stuff. Not fun and like motoric in the way that Can and Noi and, you know, some of the early Kraftwerk stuff is. This is really confrontational music. It was really political, and these guys were really going for it. This is intense stuff, almost proto-punky in a lot of ways, and I highly, highly recommend checking out this album. If you're into the heavier side of krautrock, this thing will knock your socks off, and it's very hard to come by. It's very cool how the album was put together in a really DIY fashion. There's actual staples holding the jacket together, and this is an original German pressing. I believe that has the poster in it as well. On the lighter side of things, but still punky, the Undertones debut album. This one's self-titled. This is a UK pressing of the Undertones' first record on Sire. This is one of the greatest punk albums of all time, in my opinion. It's extremely catchy. It's got teenage kicks on it. Every song on here is an absolute banger, and it's a flawless album through and through. One of my favorite records in the genre. I always play Here Comes the Summer when the spring season is wrapping up, because it puts me in the mood to go to the beach and hit the pool and so on and so forth. It's a really, really good one. And I highly recommend checking this out if you need a pick-me-up. It always makes me feel very, very happy. Mooney Suzuki, this is a more modern record, not exactly anymore. I think this record came out in like the late 90s or early 2000s. I was just out of high school or into college when this record came out, and I was way into the Mooney Suzuki. Speaking of krautrock, the Mooney Suzuki, for those of you who don't know, are named after Malcolm Mooney and Damo Suzuki from the band Can. Cool band name for sure. Electric Sweat is, I think, probably their best album. These guys were incredible live, super, super high energy, like throwback, proto-punk style rock and roll, garagey punk, I guess is probably a better way to put it. They were operating around the same time the White Stripes and the Black Keys were coming up, and they would give both of those bands a run for their money back in the day. I don't know what ended up happening to the Mooney Suzuki. They definitely haven't stayed on the tips of people's tongues. But when I was doing college radio back in the early 2000s, I was definitely playing a lot of Mooney Suzuki, especially that album. And because we're running out of time, we'll stop here. This is the Johnny Bernett Trio. This is, Johnny Bernett and the Rock and Roll Trio. This is one of the greatest rockabilly albums of all time. It doesn't look like much when you look at that cover. You could skip over this thing if you didn't know what you were looking at, but do not. Cramps fans, take note. This is one of the rawest rockabilly recordings you could get your hands on, and this is not an OG. The original pressings are worth somewhere between $600 and $1,000. It's a very rare album. I thought this might have been an original when I looked at it at first. Looks very similar, but there's just a few subtleties that make it very obviously an undated repress. I assume this came out sometime in the 60s or 70s because it's still got a tip-on jacket. It looks legit. This one was still in the shrink, but it is the repress and a fraction of the price at just $50. So it's super, super clean. It looks like it was played once max. And yeah, anyway, rockabilly. Not something I talk about very often, something I absolutely enjoy. And if you're looking for one rockabilly recommendation today, let me tell you to check out Johnny Bernett and the Rock and Roll Trio. This album slays. It is so killer. On that tip, the first copy of that record that I found came out of this load of records that somebody brought to the store back in, I don't even know, 5 or 10 years ago. No, 10 or 8 or 10 years ago. Let's say that. They had a pickup truck full of records. They had just come from another record store, and they told them to bring them to us because we would buy anything. And at the time, we would buy anything because I used to have a buyer that would pay me a quarter for any record we bought. So we would take anything off the street for at least a dime a piece, and obviously pay a lot better for good stuff. Well, the pickup truck's rolling over to the shop, and they asked me to come out and comb through the records because they needed to be done with them. There was a house clear out, and they had the truck full of records, and they wanted to go home with an empty truck. Well, right as I get out to the pickup truck, it starts raining. And I'm like, oh boy, we got to get these records out of the truck and get on our way. And they're like, we only have 10 minutes. We got to get out of here. We're on our way to another appointment. So I was like, okay, well, looks like there's about 1,000 records here. And it looked like garbage. It had already been passed on by another store. And it was all easy listening, Andy Williams, and just like the Barbra Streisand of the worst bargain bin thrift store staples of all time. And so I was like, looks like there's 1,000 records in here. I'm sure I can unload them all for a quarter a piece if it comes to that. Without looking through everything, I can't offer you much of anything for them, but I'll pay you, I forget what I gave him, a few $100 or something. So he was like, gladly, here, take them. And we run them all into the store as the rain's coming down. And lo and behold, after we dug through all 1,000 records or whatever, there was an original copy of this record buried in there. I didn't get the seller's name or anything. I have no idea who it was, and we ended up selling that record for many hundreds of dollars. A while later, it took a minute, but it did finally sell. That's how I didn't first become acquainted with that record then, but that was the first original copy we had in the shop. I think we've had one or two since then, but they're very hard to come by. Okay, this video is going a little longer than I wanted to. I just want to thank you very much for staying tuned until the end, and please stay tuned for another video coming soon. Until then, cheers, y'all.